Thanks so much for being here today. And let's find out where everyone's joining us from. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining.
We have our friends Nada and Mike Dolbeck joining.
Yes. And I just went ahead and dropped in the chat. If you want to tell us where you're joining from, that would be awesome. Excited to see everyone here today. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to just give it a couple more minutes before we get started. We're just waiting for this virtual room to fill up. Thanks. Menlo Park. Hey, Mike. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us today. Hoboken. All right. East Coast. Portola Valley. Awesome. I'm joining from Pleasanton. Okay, the room is filling up more and more. Los Angeles, awesome. Hey, Brooke. Menlo Park, some more Menlo Park. We've got a lot of South Bay. Okay. San Ramon, all right. Some more East Bay too.
We have our friend Evgeny.
Oh yeah, in Russia. I missed that.
From Moscow, Russia.
There you go.
I wonder what time it is in Moscow.
Awesome, great. So we're gonna get started here in just a moment, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today, Data Bees. All right, so we're gonna get started here. Hi, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to the Hive's Think Tank webinar series. We've got an awesome panel lined up for you today. We're going to be discussing the risky road to autonomous mobility. My name is Maddie Watt, and I'm the Senior Manager of People and Programs at the Hive. First, I'm going to go over the ground rules for today's webinar, and then I'm going to explain what the Hive Think Tank does before I pass the virtual mic over to TM Ravi, the Hive's founder and Managing Director. So let's get started here. Ravi, do you mind pulling up the slides? Thank you. Okay.
You see it?
I do. Perfect. And then it's just not moving, Ravi? Just one second, guys. Perfect. Thank you. Great. So let me just really quickly go over the ground rules. The ground rules are, please be respectful in the chat and refrain from product plugs. This is not the place to be recruiting for your startup. Thank you so much for being understanding and respectful. We love questions. Please use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. So if you look at the very bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A button. That's the way to ask the presenters questions, not in the chat. This makes it easier for the presenters to see the questions all in one area. So if you could just please use the Q&A button, we'd really appreciate it. And you can upvote questions that you want to see answered. This session is being recorded and will be available to view later on the Hive's YouTube channel. And I'll make sure to drop the link for that into the chat. And to follow along or contribute on social media, please use the hashtag HiveData or tag us at HiveData. And at the end of this session, I'm going to send out an event feedback survey. If you want to take, it's just 5 questions. If you want to take a minute to fill it out, it really helps us design events specifically tailored to your needs and wishes. So we'd appreciate that, and I'll drop that link as well. So the Hive Think Tank, what do? What are we? We are an ecosystem of entrepreneurs, corporations, and thought leaders. We are currently bringing you virtual events every week, and we've got a really awesome lineup, so I'm going to go over that and drop the links to register for those in just a few minutes. We have done over 200 events. We have a community over 11,000 members, and we have incredible speakers, including the guys today. So we're super excited, and thank you for joining us.
Especially the guys today.
Yeah, they're the best. That's why you guys are here. So Ravi, if you don't mind, next slide, please. Thank you. We want to do a special thank you to our sponsors, especially Avanta Ventures, who is helping put on this session, as well as David Lee is moderating and is representing Avanta. So Avanta is awesome, along with the rest of our sponsors, TIBCO, SAP, IBM, Verizon, and Intuit. And if you want to find out more about sponsoring or doing a webinar with us, please email me. I'll drop my email in the chat, and it's maddie@hivedata.com. So next week, we have an event called Cracking the Code, Can Effective COVID Tracing and Privacy Coexist? This is something we had originally scheduled at the beginning of June. We had to push it out, so now it's finally here with much fandom. So we're super excited to find out all about contact tracing, and we hope you'll join us next Thursday. Next slide, thank you. And then we're going to do on the 19th, remote operations and intelligent asset solutions in oil and gas. We're also going to be doing the week before, sorry, I mixed up the slides. We're doing a 3-part series on medicine for ailing healthcare industry. And this is going to be a really great in-depth 3-part series where we talk all about the healthcare and how data-driven platforms and AI is changing the healthcare landscape. And our part 1 is all about affordability in healthcare. Next slide, Ravi. Thank you. And then we've got Legends of Technology. I put these out of order, but don't worry. I'm going to drop them in order when I put them in the chat. Legends of Technology is going to be an awesome in-depth conversation with Joel Burnham, who Ravi used to work with. He was the head of HP Labs and head of computer science at IBM TJ Watson. So we are going to get to pick his brain, and I highly recommend you join us for that. I will be joining or sending you guys the links for the registration for these in order. Thanks, Ravi. Next slide. And then at the end of August, we are going to do CDC and FDA guidelines and COVID testing. So this is going to be an in-depth conversation about how testing works. Is it even working at all? So this is going to be highly controversial and interesting. We hope that you'll join us on Wednesday, the 26th. And then last one. And then we're going to take a turn and we're going to talk about luxury and fashion and how sustainability is improving the fashion world with data. And that will be on September the 2nd. And without further ado, Ravi.
Great. So we have a lot of events. Thank you, Maddie. And we hope that all of you database can join us. So very briefly about the Hive. The Hive is a venture capital entity. It's a particular kind of venture capital entity called a venture studio. And what is a venture studio? A venture studio is an entity that's very actively involved with entrepreneurs in helping start companies, and then we are joined in the hip with them for the first year and a half or so to help make these companies viable. And so our focus is around AI and data as applied to the enterprise. And you'll see us kind of play in a number of different areas, including the insurance space, which is a topic for today. And we tend to use the same sort of approaches, data-related approaches. Those are some of our startups. A number of our startups have gone on to get acquired or go IPO. And we are working on a number of new companies. If you're interested, please reach out to us. One around cloud MRP and resilient supply chains. Another one around healthy buildings, healthy spaces. A third company on automating remote field services. Think about it as kind of a vertical zoom, a field services zoom, and beyond. And so we'd love to engage with you. If you are going to be on Twitter today, please use the hashtag HiveData. And with that, I'd like to introduce the moderator of the event today, David Lee. David?
Thanks, Ravi. And thanks everyone so much for joining. We're super excited to host this event with Ravi, Maddie, and kind of the rest of the Hive team here. We've got a super fascinating topic we're discussing today and a great panel with us here representing several of the different stakeholders within the broader autonomous vehicle ecosystem. And we'd love to keep the conversation pretty free-flowing as well. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A window I actually see some showing up already. I'll be monitoring that along the way. So I want to get started by having all of us here share a little bit more about our backgrounds and companies, so everyone kind of gets a better sense of who we are. I'm happy to help us kick it off here, and then we'll turn it over to our esteemed panelists. So I'm part of the investment team here at Avanta Ventures, and Avanta Ventures is the venture arm of CSAA, which is one of the insurers within the AAA ecosystem. We're focused on early stage, mostly Series A investments within mobility, insurtech, and some adjacent areas like fintech and cybersecurity. In addition, we also run a venture studios program that Netta Blocko from our team leads, where we'll work with even earlier stage businesses, pre-seed, seed stage, to create kind of customized programs to really help them accelerate growth. I personally spend a lot of my time here nerding about all things mobility. Have been with the team for a little over 2 years now. Prior to joining Avanta, was investing in another venture fund called Longitude Capital, mostly in growth stage companies, Series B and C type businesses. Also spent some time working on the other side in product at an enterprise software company called Pivotal for a while. And before that, started my career in investment banking, doing M&A at Lazard. So with that, let me hand it over to our panel. Brian, do you want to kick us off here?
Absolutely, happy to. Thank you all for having me. My name is Brian Gaab. I am with CSAA Insurance Group. CSAA Insurance Group is a AAA insurer. We write personal lines, home, and auto insurance in 23 states and Washington, D.C., and have a newly established commercial lines insurance company as well. The company's been around for over 100 years, and obviously when most people think of AAA, they think of roadside assistance, and depending on where you are, there's a lot of different AAA services offered. AAA insurance is AAA insurance is there's 3 different insurance companies within AAA. CSAA Insurance Group. We're based here out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and as I mentioned, right in about 23 states in DC. My role within the company, I sit in our strategy and innovation organization, and working with technology companies, working with our internal stakeholders, our core business, to ultimately bring new products and services, bring radical changes to our existing products and services from the outside in and developed within. So I'm excited to be speaking with you guys about autonomous vehicles today.
Dirk?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your time today. My name is Dirk Beth, and I'm co-founder of Robotics. I've been in the technology space for a little over 20 years. Started out my career at Volkswagen Group, implementing technology globally, and then spent some time in consulting. Founded my first company in 2005, had 3 exits since then, acquired 4 companies, mostly in the healthcare and life sciences space. Really got interested in autonomous systems, and that's the genesis of founding Above Robotics with a roboticist out of Texas A&M.
Sergey?
Thank you for having me. My name is Sergey. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Koop Technologies. We are the company based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we provide the end-to-end autonomy insurance services. Part of our solution is the insurtech platform that we built in-house that lets autonomous vehicle companies share data with us and get custom data-driven coverage. And on the insurance side, we also make sure that the insurance get access to those autonomy insights so they can provide the tailored coverage for the autonomous vehicle companies. Our team has background in financial services, autonomous vehicle software engineering, and insurtech, commercial insurtech. So we're pretty diverse and excited to share our thoughts and opinions on the state of the industry today.
Awesome. Well, let's dive right in then. Dirk, maybe I'll start with you. And just to kind of level set here, there's been a lot of chatter around autonomous vehicles for quite a while now, but I still can't go outside and hail an AV to pick me up on my phone, right? So maybe help us understand kind of where are we today in the world of AVs?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's a great level of expectation, from the average consumer on, why AVs aren't here yet. And if you listen to Elon's earnings report this week, he's still very enthusiastic about bringing AVs and how much value that's going to unlock in everyone who owns a Tesla's vehicles and Tesla itself. But there are a number of challenges, of course. I mean, I would say that this is going to be the hardest. We're currently in the hardest time ever for autonomous vehicles, and the reason is that there's no infrastructure. Everything that we do on the road currently is for a human driver. So we've got a big red stop sign. Okay, that's really easy for a human to recognize, but it's not the best way to communicate to a vehicle. So there's no infrastructure for it, and we're still building up the learning on how self-driving works, and of course we're dealing with the regulatory environment, right? So you've got vehicles driving on the street, which is a highly regulated already with human drivers, and we're still trying to understand that. There's a lot of testing going on, and sure, absolutely the technology will get there where you can do highly sophisticated self-driving, and there's this expectation that we can't release self-driving vehicles or autonomous vehicles until they're 100% perfect, right? But I grew up in Michigan, and people are driving out in 2 feet of snow where they can't really see the street, and the wind is blowing and visibility is near zero, and people probably shouldn't be driving in those conditions either. So it's really hard to expect that we're going to let vehicles do that. And so, I think that expectation of level 5 driving, and we can't approve this until it's 100% safe. Well, I mean, really, it's when these things become safer than a human is when we really should be looking at releasing them. But David, I would say that there is already there's a lot of advancement going on in everyday cars, from ADAS to driving a Tesla. I mean, I can go 100 miles without driving the vehicle in a Tesla right now. So there's progress being made, but the expectations and what people want are really demanding right now.
Makes sense. And certainly a lot of things to unpack there. Sergey, as you kind of look at this space, Dirk kind of brought up regulatory infrastructure as some of the issues, but why have AVs kind of not kept up with the hype? What are some other challenges that the industry is facing?
Sure. So I have a couple points to make here, and that's a very exciting question for a lot of people. So I think, first of all, it's important to start looking at the autonomous vehicle progress in different buckets. So the industry is fragmented not only by the mode of the transportation, but also by the operating domain. And for example, if we compare robotaxis to autonomous trucks to deliveries, each of them at a different stage of the development. For example, there recently was a lot of funding and news announced in the autonomous trucking space, and more commercial contracts being made there than in the robotaxi, for example. So I think when we talk about the progress, we should try to isolate those things and see what each mode of transportation makes. And the second point, for example, like we're based in Pittsburgh, and we see autonomous vehicles all the time. Like every time you go on the street, you see 3 to 5 vehicles on any given day from 3 different companies. And when you're on the road in a car, you interact with those vehicles. But like in our domain, it's a common. They do not take the passenger trips, but people know about them. Versus New York, where probably it's not going to happen for the foreseeable future. And another point is, that's where I would agree with Dirk, that there is a lot of things that we had to do in the regulatory and infrastructural side, is that we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar industry that one of the few industries that has really exponential growth opportunity to come. And it's not going to be solved overnight. And I feel like once this progress is made, all the pieces are going to follow, and we're finally going to get there.
Yeah. Next question for you, Brian, and this is actually one of the audience questions as well. But there's been kind of like Sergey mentioned, chatter about more phased deployments, right? Limiting the operating domain, the geography of AVs as a starting point, so you can manage the number of edge cases that come up. What are your thoughts on that approach, and where are you seeing companies kind of find success there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's something very topical because, and actually even backtracking a little bit, I was thinking about the question you asked a moment ago around kind of hype. Hype's a really funny thing. I was thinking about how, like, I think it was the early '60s that the Jetsons came out, and about how much the expectation of right now in 2020 that we'd probably all be in flying cars and have robot maids. We're pretty far from that, and just how inaccurate sometimes hype cycles can be. But I guess I'm an insurance guy. I'm not a tech guy, but this stuff is really hard. And David, to your point, these fringe cases are the hardest thing and probably the most important thing. I kind of think about it in two tracks. You've got companies out there. I think Sergey just referenced some of them that are either in limited test environments like closed tracks, or in or on kind of tracks within permitted city areas, operating in higher levels of autonomy. And then you've got basically advancements of ADAS technology, similar. So you could kind of put them into two categories to kind of bucket it. You've got your Waymos of the world that are operating on closed tracks or in closed environment areas. And you've got Teslas out there, which have kind of mass produced and obviously, I think that you're seeing success in both of those categories. And I don't think you can point to one or the other and say that's right or that's wrong. They're all right. They're all wrong. We've had both success in both of those tracks and learnings and advancements that have happened in both of them, and frankly, failures that have happened in both of them. The reality of the situation is those technologies, whether it's the Uber or Teslas, have had fatal crashes, right? That are outside of the human's fault. And you've also had kind of significant advancements in those technologies. I rented a Tesla in, I think it was about 2015, and just remembering what that experience was like of, oh my gosh, having to grab the wheel so many times because I thought it was going to, run into something, and now it's significantly better. And the same can be said of kind of the more closed loop environments. But I think it's about simplifying the use cases, focusing in on where the technology is versus where it isn't, and then preparing for those scenarios.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And another topical question from our audience here: have you seen changes as a result of COVID? Is COVID impacting the autonomous vehicle industry? And if so, where are you guys seeing some of that?
So David, if I can take this, I mean, so we are primarily involved in orchestrating different autonomous vehicles for primarily ports and manufacturers. And so if you think about ports, there are a lot of vehicles driving around, moving containers, forklifts, and there's, even before COVID hit, there was a great interest to automate more of that, even to just do better routing in those areas where you could avoid driving into the most congested area of the port on a given day. And so just helping solve that problem is valuable to a lot of these industries. Fast forward to when COVID hit, it became essential. A lot of these areas, whether you're talking about factories or ports or airports, where people could not show up to work, the supply chain was being put under a lot of strain and risk. And so it certainly has advanced our discussions with a lot of new customers in this, who are some component of the supply chain. And so I would say that, one of the things that we saw early on was that, sure, efficiency gains, even, wear and tear on equipment reduced. But what was bubbling to the surface was risk reduction in many of the areas that we're addressing. Was one of the key areas that people wanted to adopt autonomous solutions for. Now, of course, COVID, it's a different kind of risk, but if COVID went away today, anyone who's involved in these businesses is thinking about when this happens the next time, we need to be ready. And so, when you look at Above Robotics, it's really focused on the vehicles that are moving around outside of the factory, that next layer out from what has already been automated within the four walls of the factory. And so certainly we've seen, an increase in interest in resolving that problem. And I would say, the end goal, the Jetsons' goal, is that the supply chain end to end could have autonomy. But if you go those layers out, we're really addressing that next layer outside of the factory where you can actually make a real big impact today.
Right. Brian, Sergey, anything else to add there?
I'd like to add a couple of words about more in the deliveries and robotaxis. Despite COVID, we've seen really good financing rounds from autonomous vehicle companies. I think what COVID has done, it has definitely brought attention back to autonomous vehicles to some sense. And we understand that, autonomy is not only going to solve the productivity and safety problem, but also a problem like this, and something that we did not even think about in 2019. So I think this is this will be a good boost for the autonomous vehicle development for the next decade.
Yeah, just a quick point. I'm not a venture investor, but one of the things that I've kind of observed from the outside looking in is that there is a constraints that industry is putting on. There's more depth into known entities and less depth into new entities. I also think we've seen some interesting kind of shifts in for AV in where those dollars are going. And not even just related to the funding side of things, but also from an approval. Like, for example, Neuro got an emergency approval in California for testing that they California specifically kind of said in the memorandum that it was because of COVID and the need for different solutions in a different environment. So I thought that there are some shifts. I think we're still a little early to tell what they are fundamentally, but I think you're starting to see some writings on the wall as to where they're going to go.
Yeah, good points there. Let's talk about safety, because that seems to be at the core of all of this. So maybe Brian, I'll go to you on this one, but how do you think about measuring and understanding the safety of an autonomous vehicle?
Yeah, it's a very, very real and very important question, and one that I find myself grappling with quite a lot. If I think about, there's different lenses for which you can look through kind of the safety. And I'll take the kind of insurance lens, and perhaps other panelists can take other lenses which are equally important. From an insurance perspective, how we've traditionally thought about auto insurance, or frankly, other lines of insurance, is through long periods and long data sets, right? Looking at many years, historical information. We have actuarial models that get very specific about individuals and their propensity to be involved in crashes based on many factors, whether that is driving history, amount of driving, many factors that I probably don't have to explain to this group. As I think about kind of autonomous now, we shift our lens to say, not how can we underwrite a person or a house or something like that, but how can we underwrite a computer system that is constantly evolving? And in the case of, for example, some of these autonomous vehicles, with the simple push of a button, all those underwriting models that have gone, maybe taken years to develop, can quickly change on a dime. And that's a real challenge, right, from an insurance perspective. There's also, I mean, you know, some of this in the long term, you can say, look, if this technology gets amazing, there's absolutely no accidents. Yes, there's fundamental kind of you know, challenges associated with that for an insurer like CSAA. I think there's always going to be some form of insurance. I mean, trees are going to keep falling on autonomous vehicles, probably the same way they fall on regular cars. There's going to be, you know, natural disasters that aren't going to go away. I just think, you know, between now and that nirvana period, we are going to see an advancement of ADAS technology and a large amount of gray area. There's going to be a lot of kind of fault questions that are going to come into play. There already are a lot of fault questions coming to play with some of these ADAS technologies. I can point to many examples of kind of product liability gone right and gone wrong, historically speaking. Whether it's kind of the Tecate airbag situation, which was a massive, you know, product liability situation that impacted, you know, what is it, every Toyota vehicle or something, a very large amount of things. So I think we're going to see incremental kind of changes through ADAS, and we're going to see some larger scale changes through kind of driving behavior, and as insurers kind of try to ultimately understand those safety components of vehicles.
Yeah. Dirk, I mean, as you've spoken to some of your partners here, are they thinking about it in the same way?
So I mean, from a safety perspective, I think there's really a number of factors, right? I mean, there certainly is the insurance side. I mean, if the promise is true that we're going to eliminate accidents and eventually deaths because of these vehicles being much safer, that presents a great risk of you know, loss of revenue for the insurance companies. But you know, the benefit to society is obviously very large. Now, can you actually, you know, significantly reduce accidents and deaths when you've got a vehicle that's moving, you know, at a high rate of speed, you know, on a road where something could, like I said, a tree could fall in the way, or a person could step in the way? Sure, the ability to stop a vehicle is better, but you know, physics is physics, so things are going to happen. I mean, accidents will still happen, people will still die. And the measure, I think, really needs to be how much better is it than the current situation. Because if we look at that nirvana that Brian is talking about, it's really not going to ever happen, and that can't be our measure of when we approve and let things drive autonomously. So that is the big debate right now: is what is the measure of safety that is acceptable? And I don't think anyone has really agreed on that yet. As companies are developing these systems, I mean, you look at some of the robotaxi companies, and the amount of sensors that they're putting on these vehicles for safety is not feasible in production. The cost is just too high. So, you know, there is an effort to reduce the amount of sensors and the reliance on those sensors. But I think that perfect mix of what safety looks like is still up in the air.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, right? Because there's also the argument of tolerance, right? As in, you know, we get into a car today, and you know, you assume some sort of risk, or some percentage of risk, you know, however small. And is that risk tolerable when you're not driving, when a machine is driving you? Right? It's a little bit unclear. Or do you want that risk to be even lower, and how much lower does it need to go? So it's an interesting topic of discussion. Sergey, you know, on that note, right, there's been a lot of chatter about kind of what are the right metrics of success here. California obviously has their kind of disengagement reports, which companies testing on California roads have to submit. But I mean, in your opinion, is that data valuable, and what other metrics would you want to consider, you know, as you're evaluating safety?
So disengagements, they are valuable. However, given the certain context, if you take disengagements as a raw, unspecified data set, it barely has value. However, if you try to explain what leads to the disengagement, maybe there are a couple of metrics that can explain the disengagement, and what the action that came out of this. Was the disengagement because of the autonomy dropout, or was it human initiated? If it was human initiated, was it because the human had a bad judgment, or was it because there was some externality threat that you had to take over? So with this context, it becomes valuable. And even more so, if you take the disengagement as the data set and try to run correlations with other metrics, that's where you start looking for patterns. And these patterns can explain the operations and eventually can explain the risks, which helps us arrive at the insurability case. Disengagements are just a small fraction of things that we look at. We have multiple metrics, and those metrics are really insightful when you correlate one against each other. And we account for those in our internal framework when we try to assess the insurance case.
Got it. Brian, anything to add there from the insurance carrier perspective?
Yeah, I think anything is insurable. Just to be totally clear here, right? If Tom Brady's legs are insurable, like, we can figure a way to insure autonomous vehicles. But I do think you kind of get to this question of product liability versus traditional insurance, and that's a really interesting one, because they're both forms of insurance in a way, but they're different, right? One says, all right, I have a lot of data, I'm going to predict what's going to happen. Another one is I'm assessing this overall kind of product and ensuring that. And I think that the reality is that you're going to see a melding of the two, because right now I think this is just going to, there's really, as Dirk kind of mentioned, we're not going to snap our fingers and have L5 here. It's not going to happen. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see this advancement of ADAS. You're going to see traditional insurance models and product liability kind of overlap quite a bit.
Yeah. And Dirk, maybe I'll come back to you here, but what are some of the approaches that the industry is taking to kind of define and guarantee kind of safe enough, right? And as you've talked to your customers, how do they get comfortable that a system is safe enough to deploy, whether it's in ports or otherwise?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, just let me jump back to the disengagement piece real quick. I think two valuable measures there. From an industry perspective, if you've got industry information across different manufacturers on disengagements, that helps you measure, the rising tide of all of them and who's kind of falling behind as far as their safety. So human drivers are a way to acknowledge that there may be something wrong with the software. And second, from a technical development perspective, it's a great way to isolate incidents because there's a disengagement, what happened right before that, so that we can program for those edge cases. And as far as safety related to that early adoption, where it's not necessarily driving people around but goods, a lot of these areas are great testing grounds, because you can train the people that are working in and around these vehicles that there is an autonomous vehicle driving around, or several of them. And it's a better use case than the general public, who may not be aware that there's one of these things driving around. So there's all sorts of efforts to be able to communicate to pedestrians that there's an autonomous driver vehicle here, and that you may, it sees that you're there and it's not going to run you over. So that's one thing. Those are even things like eyes, broadcast on the vehicle. We don't know if that's the right way to go yet from a public perspective space. In the ports and airports and manufacturing facilities, there's very expensive equipment there. Let's take aircraft, for example. You've got a $500 million aircraft that a tug runs into. not only is it very costly to repair that, but it takes that aircraft out of commission for a while. So those are different considerations that are being brought to us, in the work that we're doing. And so, the vehicles that are driving around there, maybe they're the same vehicle, Ford F-150, for instance, but they're okay making it look different, adding a lot more sensors in order to avoid these kind of accidents. And they're not necessarily the same accidents that would happen on the public roads. And so I think it really comes down to the amount of testing that's going on. Now, as far as when we're going to see these things on the street and what safety is required there, it's the measure that everyone is discussing is miles per incident. So how many miles are driven in a fleet of vehicles before there's an incident? And, we know that for people, human drivers, and human drivers, quite honestly, are more and more distracted. We've got drinking and driving that goes on, and some of that is hopefully alleviated with ride sharing. But so we've got miles per incidence going up for humans and going down for AVs. And so again, that's the measure, in my opinion, of overall safety for these systems. We're not quite there yet. We know that because our miles per incidence for AVs are in very controlled situations. So that will be the main factor that we're measuring.
Yeah. Another question from the audience here. But as you think about safety and risk, right, there's not just with autonomous vehicles, there's not just the risk of you getting into an accident, but then there's a lot of the product type risks that you were talking about, Brian, in terms of, what happens if this thing gets hacked, or what happens if there's quality control issues on the hardware. So how do you guys think about segmenting that and, identifying what is safe enough or, good enough to deploy in a port or an airport or other setting along those lines?
I'll start. So there are really two schools of thoughts when it comes to autonomous vehicle safety. The first school is what's called the systems engineering or safety by design. The autonomous vehicle by itself is a very complex system. And what you do, you break it down in different components, and you ensure that every component is perfectly safe. And then when you add up all the components back together, supposedly the whole thing should be safe. This is sometimes called the waterfall approach. And the second school of thought is the statistical school of thought. It says, well, if I run the real world statistics and I can prove that my autonomous vehicle fleet is on average safer than the human being, then that's safe. There are companies that do the hybrid approach. They look at both things. And when we work with our clients, we also try to account for those things. But I think the question that from the panelists is referring more to the first approach for the systems engineering. And there are companies that successfully deploy that, and eventually we'll see how that transforms into the real world metrics.
Got it. Great. Well, let's shift over a little bit to the insurance side. Brian, insurance and risk management, go hand in hand with safety, right? So how is the insurance industry thinking about this transition from insuring human drivers to machine drivers? And, without getting into too much of the nitty gritty, what's the difference between an insurance policy for an AV versus for a human?
Yeah, great question. So I can certainly address kind of the part of the question that kind of describes how we're seeing insurance policies on a traditional personal auto versus a more of a commercial autonomous program insurance solutions. On the personal auto side, I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, so I might be repeating myself a little bit, but I think we've got quite a lot of we have quite a lot of factors that, historically speaking, we take into consideration. We understand those factors. There's different variation by state in terms of what we can and can't consider. But for the most part, that's a pretty understood thing. One insurance company to another, rating models are in line, right, so to speak. When I think you shift a little bit more toward the product liability side of things when you start talking about autonomous vehicles, and that's when you see a wider range because you have different risk tolerance. Just like you see wider ranges in rates for commercial auto than you do in personal auto, you see that same type of thing. You also tie this back to the question I think Sergey was just answering around kind of the cyber side of things, right? There's kind of building blocks of insurance solutions, and for personal auto, it's relative. It's personal auto. It's kind of that's the building block. But with autonomous vehicle insurance, the building blocks are a bit different. There's a product liability piece. There's a cyber piece. There's a commercial auto piece. There's trial interruption pieces. There's many kind of different pieces that that an autonomous vehicle operator can layer together, if you will. So I think that is kind of what you're starting to see. And for the most part, from an insurance perspective right now, you're seeing those get layered in kind of from other solutions. They're not kind of built to work together perfectly just yet. Over time, I think that will change.
Yeah, another question from the audience here. Historically, credit scores have been a leading indicator for insurance, right? Or at least predictive of risk. So as you think about kind of autonomous vehicles and the future when individual kind of behavior becomes less predictive of risk, what do you foresee as those kind of leading indicators for insurance? Is it miles driven? Is it disengagements? How do you think about that?
Sure. I think this is a tough question because it's still in the making, but I can tell you it's going to be a lot of metrics, and there's going to be different metrics for different companies. We'll be looking at different metrics for trucks versus the robotaxis versus the warehouse, robotics that perform autonomous functions. So probably the best way to address this idea of having a set of metrics that can predict the safety case or the insurability case is to acknowledge the flexibility and differences between the operators. And if there is a solution like this, I think in time it will educate us on what's the approximate set of metrics that can work. But leading up to that, we have to look at a lot of data, a lot of metrics. Some of the metrics will go away, some of the metrics will come in 5 years. There may be some completely new things. So I think it's important to embrace uncertainty going forward.
Yep. And Sergey, maybe I'll stick with you here because you're working kind of across the insurance industry. But as you think about capabilities, right? What type of new core competencies, capabilities do you think that an insurer will need to develop in order to insure one of these things?
I think, so from our experience, the insurance companies want two things. They want more data, and more data is usually better than less data to try to explain how the operations work for the autonomous vehicle companies. And they also want some tools and solutions that can help get the data and make sense of this data and apply it to the insurance. So the capabilities, because autonomy is so special, it's very technologically savvy, and it has a lot of moving parts that work together. I think what the insurance companies, the capabilities that we'll need to develop will be they have to be more technical and really autonomy specific. How can you get more data from the AV company without really, bothering them, without really spending too much engineering resources of trying to fetch the next level operational location data? What frameworks do you use? There are different standards, different approaches. You can look at the product liability, the commercial liability. Maybe there is a thing, you can synthesize some of those. How do you do this in the end-to-end fashion that's more or less friendly for the underwriters? So all of those things have to be answered, and that's the work that we do at Koop as well.
Yeah.
I'll add on to that just a little bit, and I think Sergey, you brought up a really good point around kind of this the data. I think there's a strong kind of across industries. This is not just insurance, but there's a strong kind of quest for data out there, right? It's the new, it's the next, the next, across industries, you're seeing it be a very important piece. But in my mind, it's also about what's the usable data, right? If you have the data and you're not using it, it's not necessarily helpful. And so in this context, if you know, we have from a personal lines insurance standpoint, we have the data. The data is very consistent. We understand the relationship between the number of miles and the frequency of accidents pretty darn well, right? We understand the relationship between number of accidents and frequency and severity of accidents. And so we see these things, like we understand what that is. Longer term, and insurance companies have differentiated themselves recently in access to more usable data. For example, in telematics, right? Being able to incorporate more information about the use of the number of miles and the driving characteristics have differentiated one product from another. I think what we're going to see is just a continuation of that trend, meaning that with the autonomous vehicles, the more integration, the more plugging in that a carrier is ultimately going to be able to have, the better product differentiation they're going to get. Because in my experience, with a lack of usable data, a carrier's response is simply to increase price. And so that is the trade-off that ultimately I think we'll continue to see.
And Brian, how are you seeing kind of insurers work with startups or other players across the ecosystem to solve some of the challenges you've mentioned?
Yeah, I think they're all pretty early on, just in general, about kind of with regards to AVs. But maybe I'll even take a little bit of a step back and say that historically speaking, insurance companies have kind of retained most of their intellectual property and built most things internally. And I think that changed kind of on the heels of the fintech revolution into the insurtech revolution that has been going on for, call it a handful of years, right? That we've seen, and so I think that there's a significant increase in willingness to partner with the startup community, broadly speaking, across kind of the insurance field. I mean, David, you and I can give a number of examples of how we're partnering at CSAA with Avanta startups or the broader startup community in general. But I think that's going to continue. I think you're seeing very early stages of it right now with regards to AV.
Yep. Dirk, let me come back to you here. For commercial fleets and businesses, like you were talking about, AVs obviously represent an opportunity to drive increased efficiency, cost savings, all of those benefits, but they may not have the technical know-how, I mean, in some sense similar to an insurance company, to manage a fleet, right, of these autonomous vehicles or to evaluate risk and safety. So how are they thinking about kind of coordination, management, and dealing with the risk when it comes to AVs?
You're absolutely right. We were early discussions before COVID with a large airline, and they, like many airlines and airports, are really interested in autonomy, primarily because the workforce is pretty great at an airport, and there's a lot of people under the wing of an aircraft when you arrive at the gate to take the luggage off, refuel, stock the aircraft with food. And, a lot of the people that are driving these vehicles around, it's not their main responsibility to drive that vehicle around. It's to actually add fuel to the aircraft. And so they came to us and said, well, we don't really know where to start. And we know, we have a diversity of vehicle systems, and they're going to be all from different manufacturers. So we need one way to like a single pane of glass to see, how to operate and what these vehicles are doing and where they are and how issues are being resolved. And so I would say that, that's the problem that we're solving at Above Robotics. And so I think it's it's a good place to start to think about, okay, well, how are you managing, before you're even managing them, how are you managing those vehicle systems? Assessing safety, you're right. That's an area of expertise that most of these companies don't necessarily have from a technical perspective. And, at some point they're going to have to get more savvy on that and or have some diligence on the different vehicle systems. And we're working with a lot of those different companies who are providing the individual vehicle system. And I can tell you there's a wide variety of level of sophistication and where these companies are as far as their technical advancement in development of those systems. So it will be challenging for companies to adopt this technology purely from an evaluation perspective. Now, I will say that that's probably very different than it is, in a personal vehicle, right? Where you select based on, what other people are driving, what color it is, and things like that. So insurance will be challenging in very different ways for both of those different areas of adoption of autonomous vehicles. So from a safety perspective, if you look at, 15 years in the future, if this technology continues down the path that it's going, you're going to have the ability to remove safety features that we've come to expect on the vehicles because we just won't need them. We won't need as big a crumple zones. We won't need, as many airbags. And those are all very expensive things in engineering a vehicle. So we can actually bring the price of the vehicle down. And that's interesting for both sides of the equation, right? And in general, if you look at electrification, there's just a lot less mechanical functionality in one of those vehicles. And so 15, 20 years from now, couple that with the sharing economy on, not having to own a vehicle because one will just come pick you up. Very different world than it is today.
Yep. I know we're coming up on the top of the hour here, but I know there's a number of founders out in the audience. So Dirk, Sergey, what are some of the biggest lessons here that you've learned running an AV business? And what advice do you have for founders looking to enter in the space? And Brian, a question for you on the corollary of that is, any advice for companies who are interested in partnering with insurers like CSAA, and how do you build a successful partnership?
I can just jump in real quick. I would say, if you're doing anything related to a business related to autonomous vehicles, look at what you can do today. Don't wait for that magic future, the Jetsons scenario that Brian described. What can you implement today? How can you start to generate revenue today? Whether that's something that you can sell to an existing automotive company, or with that vision of the future, how can we change the future too? So I would say ground yourself in reality and be ready to sell today.
One of the things.
Start with real problems, right? What are the real problems, either immediately or in the near-term future? Solve those, build upon the success.
One of the things that I can share that we find a lesson learned for founders for the AV space is that when you look at the external stakeholders in autonomy, people outside of the autonomous vehicle companies, and you look at their opinions and their consensus, and you compare it to the people inside the autonomous vehicle companies who work on the technology, this opinion is quite different. A great example is self-insurance. People outside of the industry talk about self-insurance and how self-insurance might kill the traditional insurance industry that we know, versus people inside the industry have a completely different opinion. And, we got a ton of evidence to support that. So make sure you got insights like this from the industry.
Great. Well, I think we are out of time, so I don't want Ravi and Maddie getting mad at me, so I'll turn it back to them.
Thank you, David and Sergey, Brian, Dirk. We really enjoyed the conversation. And Matty, I think you will post the video of this Zoom event on YouTube.
I will. I'm going to drop that again right here in the chat. And I'm also going to drop our event feedback survey. So if you guys just want to take a minute to do that, that would be awesome. And we hope everyone stays healthy and well and safe. And we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Bye-bye.